is everyone?
Hey everyone, welcome to the OklaRoots YouTube channel. Welcome to month 1, block 1 of our OklaRoots block party. Oh yeah! So I was actually a quilter first before I started making bags. Making quilt blocks, making quilts is such a passion of mine. There's something so special about a quilt because it takes so long to make and you can put so many different feelings into it that you can kind of show through fabric choices and quilt block designs that in the end you have this beautiful quilt. It's like a time capsule showing what you were going through at that point in your life. It's a physical thing that represents a hug. You know what I mean? So if you make a quilt for a loved one and then they drape it around them, it's like when you're not there, they can still feel you hugging them. And there's just something so special that very few other things can actually do. So before we get started, I just want to warn you, even though I've been making quilts for years, I am no expert at this. There are so many different ways to build a proper quilt block. And you will find a lot of diehard quilters swear up and down that their method is the best and the only method to use. I'm not going to do that, all right? I'm going to show you how I build my quilt blocks. And if you have a better way, leave it in the comment section down below. If you have a different way, maybe you don't know if it's better or not, but you want to share it, leave it in the comment section down below. These are going to be videos that allow all of us to learn from one another. I'm showing you what I do, but that might not be the best method for you. So if you're struggling building your quilt block the way that I show you how to build it, make sure to check the comments and see other advice that other quilters are going to be giving. So I don't actually have names for my blocks. We're just going to call them month number 1, month number 2. So this is block month number 1. If you're in social media, you saw me sharing this one. Like I said, this is a lot of fabric that honestly was probably going to get kicked to the curb, donated something pretty soon. It was going to leave my craft space soon. So I used it to test out the block design. And I'm a true believer that if it's a good block design, almost any fabrics you put with it should look pretty cool. I'm really happy with this. Like I said, these are fabrics that I normally wouldn't reach for, but I'm really happy with this block design. I made a second version in preparation for this video, and I was a little bit more precise on how I cut my fabrics. So this is the second version, and you can see it's just a really fun, it has this it's supposed to look like these two pieces are kind of lapping over one another, like folding over one another. So you can get really creative with your fabric choices here. This can be super scrappy. Every single one of these pieces can be a different piece of fabric. If you're going to be making the full quilt, you're going to need to make 3 of these blocks this month. I find that this block does come together fairly easy if you have some experience in making quilt blocks. If not, don't worry, I'm going to guide you through the entire thing. We're going to be going into detail over the seam allowances, all of that jazz, and what to do if your block doesn't measure up to the right size. So don't forget, if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please consider clicking subscribe down below on the first Monday of every month up until February 2021. Woo, that sounds like the future. I mean, it is the future, but it's like future. First Monday of every month up until then, I will be posting a new quilt block video. I'll have the tutorial right here. I will have a PDF file that has the printed templates on it, and we're going to go over that in just a minute. And I will also have an SVG file. The SVG file is only for those of you with cutting devices. Cricut Maker, Brother Scan and Cut. I think the newer Silhouettes can cut fabric as well. Those SVG files are for those automatic cutting makers. You don't have to have any sort of cutting device in order to make these blocks. Scissors, pencil, fabric, that's all you need. So you can print off the templates, cut them out, trace them, which is what I'm going to be showing you today, or you can use the SVG method, which is what I'll be showing you in April. If you're on social media and you want to share your blocks, make sure you use the hashtag OklaRoots Block Party. We're going to be checking in on that all the time. I cannot wait to see what you guys do with these designs. I mean, I come up with these patterns, but you guys take it to the next level. I'm super excited to see what you make with them. If you want to come chat with us about all things bags, crafts, quilts, all the things, make sure you join the OklaRoots Creatives Facebook group. I will also be posting these videos in Lori Nunemaker's Sewing Facebook. So I will have a link for both of those groups down in the description below. Make sure you're involved in them. There's going to be a lot of discussion about how to build the blocks, different ways to kind of pick your fabrics, all that fun stuff. And last of all, it wouldn't be a proper year-long party without t-shirts. That's right, I designed some t-shirts. These are totally for fun. I'm a big fan of like quilty t-shirts. So this is a t-shirt I designed. It's called Quilter in Progress. I made this design and I uploaded it to Spreadshirt. So there's all kinds of material you can put it on. I've got dog bandanas, sweaters, baby onesies, all kinds of fun stuff. So I will have a link for the Spreadshirt shop down in the description below. This t-shirt is just a basic t-shirt and it's really, really soft. It washes really well. I've had these shirts for a while. So I'm really happy with the quality of the shirts I've been getting from Spreadshirt. So links for everything will be down in the description below. I will have a link to a blog post where I have links for all of the things you'll be seeing in the tutorials except for the fabric. Now, like I said, these are scrappy blocks. We're building a scrappy quilt. So most of the fabrics I'm using are scraps, which means I don't really know where I got them all. If there is a specific fabric you are just like, Jess, I need that fabric in my life, let me know and I will do my very best to find it for you. But I do encourage you to use what you have. All right, let's get started. So the first thing you're going to want to do is print off the pattern. Now I only have a black and white printer, but the pattern will be in complete color. This is the general design. Again, it is kind of better if you look at this in color, as some of these are different colors in the diagram. But when you print off the pattern, the big thing you want are the last 2 pages. Now, when you print this, make sure you do this in Adobe Acrobat Reader from your computer and print it at 100%. This way, you'll make sure that these pattern pieces are the right size. On the pattern piece, it's going to tell you how many of each you need to cut in order to have enough for that month. You're more than welcome to use the design similar to mine. However, if you don't have enough of, let's say, block E to have 4 triangles here, then don't worry about that. Use different fabrics. What I like to do a lot is I find different fabrics that are around the same color and just use that. So you can get very creative with this design based on the light and dark colors you use in your quilt block. So once you have your pattern pieces printed off, go ahead and just cut them along the lines. So any pattern pieces that are squares or rectangles, I will give you the dimensions for that, so you do not have to trace a pattern piece for those ones. Otherwise, you're going to want to trace these out. Now, if you have a cutting device, the SVG file for these templates will be on my website to assist you in cutting it. I will be going over more in depth in April how to do that using a Cricut Maker. Today, we're just going to discuss how to make the block by tracing these templates onto our fabric. So here are the notions I'll be using today. Links for this will be in the blog post, which is linked down in the description below. I like to use these Kai scissors. If you're going to be cutting out the rectangles today using traditional rotary cutter, you're going to need your rotary cutter and a ruler. I'll be using Schmetz Universal 7010 needles. If you're a bag maker and you're used to using thicker, stronger needles, I'm just giving you a heads up that it's very likely those needles will just shove your fabric down into the machine instead of sewing through it. So it is good to use a thinner needle when you're making quilt blocks. I'll be using a 50 weight Aurifil cotton thread in my bobbin and top thread. And then I like to have 2 marking pencils. One has white chalk in it and one has like a pencil lead in it. These are both safe for fabrics. I like to use the white one when I have to trace on darker fabric, and I use the darker one when I'm tracing on lighter fabric. So these are a couple of tools that I'll be using today. They are very, very helpful, but not necessary. First, this is a 10.5 inch by 10.5 inch square ruler. My block is going to finish at 10.5 inches square, so this makes it much easier to line up in the end and trim down so it's the perfect size. This is a rotating cutting mat, and this is just very, very helpful, especially when you're trimming down squared pieces and you don't want to move the fabric around much. So like I said, these tools are not necessary, but if you've got a little bit extra cash or burning a hole in your pocket and you're really serious about making these blocks, these are going to help you a lot. And of course, the most important thing we need for our quilt block is fabric. Now I told you we're going scrappy, so this is pulled straight from my scrap bin. I have all kinds of random cuts of everything in here. So we're gonna work together on picking fabric from the scrap pile and building our block. So when picking the fabric for your block, you can go ahead and look at the colored image in the pattern to kind of give you an idea of how it's all gonna lay out. So in my previous blocks, I really wanted to showcase the angles of the pieces B, C, and D, and I used lighter tones for E and A pieces. This time I'm gonna go ahead, I'm just gonna do the opposite of that. So this time I'm going to downplay my B, C, and D cuts, and instead I'm gonna use a darker fabric on my E cut. So I'm gonna start working with my E template first, since that's my biggest template. So what I'm looking for is a darker piece of fabric that I can use with my E template. And what I do is I just kind of go along, and I think if I turn it like this, can I make that work? Oh, that's gonna be close. Let's look on the back. We're gonna have some selvage in there, but I think that will work. All right, let's kind of eyeball it real quick. 1, 2, 3. Oh, I don't know if we're gonna have enough fabric for that. So let's see, do I have some of this too? How much of this do I have? I've got this other red fabric here. I could probably get a couple pieces. So I think for my E pieces, I'm actually gonna use these 2 red pieces of fabric. So let's put that to the side. So my C and D cuts go straight in the middle of the design, and I think I want those to be lighter tones, but I want them to look good with the red. So I'm gonna be looking for neutrals. And so I usually have a bunch of whites and grays. I really like this. Oh yeah, and I've got a lot of it. So I can use this. I'll use this for my C cut. And just because I like to have as much fabric as possible, I'm gonna use a different one for my D cut. It's gonna be a little bit different, but not super different. Oh, like this. This is a cool one. Yeah, these feathers are cool. So I'll use this for my D. So that way I'll have a nice light inside cross. So now I'm focusing on the B. The B cuts are gonna go around that red. So again, I don't want it to be anything too dark. I want it to be something lighter, but I'm already using that white. So let's see. Oh, this is cool. This is like a grungy polka dot pink. That might look cool around the red. Let's try that for our B pieces. And then finally, we have our A unit. Now, since we have a lot of reds and pinks, this is kind of feeling a more feminine block, which I think is cool. I either want to go totally different with this yellow mustardy tie-dye, or I want to go along the same lines with this purple. Ooh, which one do I want to do? So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take the fabric I'm using for B, and I'm just going to lay that right in the middle of these. Ooh, that's a hard one. You know what? Go big or go home. We're going with yellow. All right, so the yellow is going in our corners, and there we go. That is how I choose fabric for a quilt block. So now this all goes back in the bin. So regardless if you're cutting out the fabric with a cutting device like the Cricut Maker or by hand using the templates, you're gonna wanna press your fabric really well, and I do suggest spraying it with some starch. I like to use Best Press pretty much because it's the easiest to find and it's the cheapest. There's lots of other really great options out there, but Best Press is the one I prefer to use. So I am just going to, one at a time, grab my scraps, give them a very light spray. I don't soak my fabric, I just give it a light mist and then press it. This iron is a cordless steam iron by Panasonic. I do not use the steam when I'm making quilt blocks. I do like it. The only thing is there's no flat edge, so you can't stand it up on its side. Now we're just gonna go through all of our fabric and giving it all a good press with starch. The reason we want the fabric to be pressed and starched so well is because obviously when we're cutting out our shapes, we don't want creases in our fabric because then they won't be the right cut. And starch just makes your fabric a little paper-like. It makes it a little bit stiffer and it prevents it from stretching just a little bit. You still are gonna have to be careful with your fabric. You don't wanna pull on it too much and stretch it out, but the starch is going to help. So now let's cut out our fabric. If you're using fabric like I am that doesn't really have a specific design in it, you can just cut out your fabric in any place. However, if you're using something like this and say you want these houses in there, you're gonna wanna make sure that you keep your fabric over the spot you want, and don't forget that we have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So don't line it right up on the houses because you will lose that 1/4 inch on the bottom. To make this easier, you are more than welcome to make plastic templates out of these blocks. I will have a link for a video down below showing you how to do that. However, every month is going to have different blocks, so unless you're making a whole quilt using this block pattern, you probably don't need to do that. So each template is going to tell you how many cuts you need of that template for that month for one block. This one I need 4 E-cuts. I'm going to use 2 different fabrics for that. Since this red is a bit darker, I'm going to use my white pencil from Fawns and Porter. And I mean, it just will barely fit on here. I don't worry so much about including part of the selvage. There are a lot of quilters that are going to tell you definitely do not use any of the selvage because the weave in the selvage is a little bit different than the weave in the fabric. It's a little bit stiffer, a little bit less flexible. I don't tend to mind that, but if you find that you're having a really hard time getting that close to the edge of your fabric on that selvage, then just don't use selvage cuts. So there's one, and then I'll trace the second one. So if you find that your template kind of shifted on you, just give it a second check. So for example, mine template was moving around while I was tracing. You can see it's off right here. I'm just going to go back over right up against it. I am using plain printer paper. It is easier if you use something like cardstock paper to print these template pieces on because it's a little bit firmer. So I do trace all of my templates on the back of my fabric. If I have a template that needs to be traced on one side or the other, I will make note of that on the template. This month, you can really trace it on the back or the front. Just be consistent. There we go. Now I like to trace out all of my pieces first and then I'll cut them all later. So I'm just going to speed through the process of tracing the rest of these. All right, once you have all of your pieces traced, now all you have to do is cut them out. I find using a pair of scissors is really the best way to cut this out. If you want, you can line up your rotary cutter. Make sure you leave these rounded-ish corners here. This is going to help line it up later. They're not actually round, they are straight lines, and do your best to keep it as straight lines and angles. It's going to make piecing it in the next step so much easier. For rectangular units, I am going to print the size of the block on the pattern pieces so that you don't have to trace them if you don't want to. For example, the D block is 4.5 inches wide by 2.5 inches tall. If you want, you can just use your ruler and cut out your block using that method. It's a lot quicker than tracing and cutting with your regular scissors. So once you have all of your pieces cut out, use the diagram on page 2 to form your block before sewing. So we're just gonna lay out all the pieces the way we want them. So this will give you an idea of what the block will look like in the end. Now, if you have a lot of different pieces of fabric, like every single one of your B-cuts is a different piece of fabric, and you have a design and you really want it to stay that way in the end, I suggest you get your phone or a camera and take a picture of the layout right now. And that way, as you're putting it all together, you'll have an easier time remembering where everything goes. So to build this block, we're actually gonna build the 4 corner quadrants first, and then we're going to piece the block together in 3 strips. So let's work on these corner pieces first. I'm gonna take out the middle strips. So each one of these quadrants is going to be built the same way. E will be sewn to B and B will be sewn to A. I like to start with the bigger units first, so I'm gonna move my A triangle out of the way. Rotate your blocks however it makes it easiest, and fold your B unit right side down on your E unit, matching up the long sides. Because you have those little notched corners, they should line up pretty well. If you used a machine like a maker, these pieces are going to be a lot more fitting with one another than if you cut them out by hand with scissors. The cutting machines just cut them more precisely than we do. So do this with each one of your 4 quadrants. You want to be careful tugging at this fabric because most likely these long edges that we're sewing together were cut on the bias of your fabric, meaning you have the weave that goes this way, and the angle was cut diagonally across that, which means it can stretch really easy. Cotton woven can stretch out pretty easy, but it doesn't stretch back. So be very gentle with this. If you find that one piece is a little bit bigger than the other piece, don't worry about that. We're gonna trim this down as we sew the unit together. If you watch my bag making videos, you know I use clips most of the time. When I make quilt blocks, I pretty much always use pins. I find that they do work better at keeping everything in place. All right, now we're gonna take these 4 units to the sewing machine and we're gonna sew them together back to back at the machine. So real quick, let's talk about seam allowances. When making quilt blocks, you want a 1/4 inch seam allowance almost. We call it a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. The reason for this is when you sew your piece of fabric together and you press it, when you open them, using that 1/4 inch seam allowance, it's actually going to end up being a tiny bit more than 1/4 of an inch wide because of the fold of the fabric, this part right here, this little fold. Well, that's not a big deal normally, but when you're making a quilt block that has a lot of small pieces, all of those little extras in your seam allowance add up and your quilt block ends up being quite a bit smaller in the end. To prepare ourselves for that, we use a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So what I like to do is I always have a small ruler next to my sewing machine. I lower my needle down all the way. And what I'm doing is I'm finding my 1/4 inch mark. Now, most likely your sewing machine has a line on it, like mine has a line right here, to mark the 1/4 inch line. You can also get a special presser foot that is a 1/4 inch presser foot. But remember, lining it up with this line or the edge of your presser foot is going to give you a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We want just a bit less than that. So I tend to go on the side of less is more here. So if I were to decrease my seam allowance to 1/8 of an inch, the marking for that would really be right here on the inside of my feed dog, right along this opening. I don't want it that small. So I'm gonna pretty much go right in the middle between the opening of my feed dog on the inner side and this 1/4 inch mark right here. This is all trial and error depending on your machine. Next, it's always nice to have a scrap piece of fabric as your leader when you're building your quilt blocks. Quilt blocks don't have any interfacing and we're usually using pretty thin fabric. This does have a tendency to go into the machine and get eaten up pretty well. So a leader fabric is just a scrap piece of fabric that we run the machine over first and then put in our quilt blocks. So for example, I'm just going to start in the middle of this fabric, go over it, and now I'm going to sew along my pinned edge at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So if you see, here's my 1/4 inch mark, here's my fabric. I'm not quite touching it. And like I said, this is just based on your machine. And then I'm just going to continue sewing each one on. I'm not cutting off this previous unit. I'm just going to keep adding a new unit and sewing it on right after the one before it. All right, once I have the last unit sewn on, I know that I'm going to be using this chaining method for a while in this block, so I'm going to reach around and I'm going to grab my little leader scrap piece of fabric and I'm just going to run that through after my last unit and have it sitting here for me for when I'm ready to come back to the machine. So now you can just cut in between each one of your units. All right, so now we're going to press our units open, just like that. Now, quilters have a lot of strong opinions on the proper way to press. However you press is going to be perfectly fine. For me, it totally depends on the block that I'm making. So for this block, I don't have a whole lot of seams. I don't have to worry about my seams bulking up too much. I am just going to press towards the darker side. So whichever fabric is darker, which is this one on the bottom, I'm going to have that wrong side up. I'm going to press it on the seam first to set that seam. Then I'm going to pull up that darker fabric so it's right side up. And I give it a little finger press, nice and gentle, don't stretch it out too much. And then I just put my iron over that seam and let it set for just a second. And then I'll flip it over and I'll put it on the back of that seam, also for just a second, and then take it off. That is how I press my units. You don't want to take your iron and push it really hard on your quilt block units because it will stretch out your fabric. I do not use steam, and I don't use any more starch when I'm pressing my block. So do this for the remaining 3 units. I used to use steam when I pressed my blocks in this step. However, I noticed that my fabric was wrinkling up. Also, when I used starch, I had the same problem. Any sort of moisture just didn't work with me and my quilt blocks, which is why now I just use a dry heat and I only starch the fabric before I cut it. All right, the 4 units we're working on should now look like this. Go ahead and grab your A pieces, which for me are these yellow cuts. And now we're just gonna sew these on to our B units. So once again, I'm gonna take a B unit and an A unit and lay them lined up how I want them to be in the end. And I'm gonna fold it down right sides together along the long edges. And those angled cuts should allow us to line up the 2 pieces perfectly. Now I'm just gonna pin these 2 together. And do the same for the other 3 units. All right, once again, we're gonna go to the sewing machine with our 4 blocks, and we're going to sew again at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, before we sew anything else, we're going to square up these blocks. This means that we're going to clean it up. If they're a little too big, we're going to cut them down. If they're a little too small, we're going to make sure we adjust our seam allowance for the rest of the block. So I like to grab my rotating cutting mat. And if you have a small square ruler, that would work here. I'm just going to use this one. Now, this block we have just made should be 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. So I like to line up my 45-degree line that's on my ruler, and I'm going to line that up with that center seam between block E and block B, corner to corner. Now, what I'm making sure of is that my 4.5 inch mark on the left side and my 4.5 inch mark on the bottom cover all of the fabric. So if your fabric doesn't reach all the way over to 4.5 inch mark and over to the edge on either of these 4 corners, your seam allowance is a little too big. You're probably using a proper 1/4 inch seam allowance, which is just too big for these units. You're going to have to decrease it just a hair. If your blocks are a little bit bigger, so for me, I have a little bit of overhang over here, even though my 4.5 inch mark is lined up pretty nicely, I'm going to trim this down. So I'm just going to trim once on this side, and then I'm going to run my rotary cutter along the top. So now if you have a rotating cutting mat, you just rotate it opposite side and do the same thing. Lining up that 45-degree mark along the middle, lining up the 4.5 inch mark on the left side and the 4.5 inch mark on the bottom, just like that. And then cut off any sides that are overhanging. And there you go. Squaring up your blocks as you go through your quilt block is going to make the finished product look a lot more like the picture than if you didn't do that. What happens is if you don't square up your blocks, you start having these kind of uneven edges. And then when you're sewing on another piece, you don't really know which line you're supposed to line it up with, and you end up with waves. You end up with some areas that are way too big, some areas that are way too small. So squaring up as you go is really helpful in having a clean finished quilt block. Do the same thing for the other 3 square units. So let's say your block here is not measuring up at 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. Like it's too small. It doesn't reach the 4.5 inch mark by 4.5 inch mark. That's okay. You're gonna still clean it up the best you can. I would still lay it over like this because most likely you're gonna have a situation where part of it doesn't reach the 4.5 inch mark, but part of it is past it. So you're still going to clean it up. The part that's too short, just ignore that. Clean up the parts that are too long. And just remember, as you go, you're going to want to make your seam allowance a tiny bit smaller. Not an 1/8 of an inch smaller, but a tiny bit smaller. Also, you might notice that your corners don't reach the corner of the 4.5 inch by 4.5 inch square. That's okay, don't worry about that. All right, now we can go on to building the strips of our block. So lay out your block once again the way you did in the beginning. I don't remember which one of these I had on the top, but I had it something like this. I'm not that picky with how my blocks turn out. Again, I'm really, really scrappy. So lay your corner units. I remember these were diagonal. So this should be what you have. What we're gonna actually do is we're gonna separate these into 3 strips. This will be strip number 1, this is strip number 2, and this is strip number 3. We're gonna build these 3 strips and then we're gonna sew them all together. So starting with strip number 1, we wanna sew this D unit onto either one of our blocks. So I'm just gonna sew it onto the top. Remember which angle it goes on and lay it right sides together with your block and then pin together. All right, you can put this to the side for sewing. Now let's work on the middle strip. You'll notice these both have diagonals and the little diagonals are gonna go right sides together. So we're not gonna sew it together like this. We're going to sew it together so that these 2 lines match up perfectly, which means it's going to fold over 90 degrees, just like that. Now, remember I told you to keep those straight notches on your corners, and it's going to help you line this up just perfect. The notched corner here should go nice and flat up against the long edge of the top piece, and then the same in reverse on the side. Pin along this diagonal line, making sure you're not stretching it too much because again, it's probably been cut on the bias, so we don't want to stretch it out. Put this to the side for sewing. And now we're on our last column. Again, I'm going to attach my D unit to the top square unit, laying it right sides together along this bottom edge. And if you're putting this together and you realize that you put something in the wrong spot, meaning let's say this unit here, you had it twisted around so the A is actually in the middle and the E is on the outside and you sewed along this D, I encourage you to leave it. If you're making the quilt, you're gonna make 3 of these blocks, save the perfection for a future block. Any way the quilt block kind of wants to go, I encourage you to let it go that way because that's kind of the fun thing about a scrappy quilt block. You're not exactly sure how it's gonna turn out in the end. So if you mess up, don't look at it as a mess up, look at it as a redesign. Okay, so I now have these 3 units I'm gonna take to the sewing machine and again sew together at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, once again, I have my leader fabric already under my needle. If you don't, I encourage you to put that under there just to make sure none of our fabric gets eaten in the feed dogs. Let's talk about how we sew together these C pieces. Just like the other ones, we're just gonna sew along this edge, again at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So let's get that leader piece sewn through. A scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, just along that edge. All right, so here are my 3 units ready to be pressed. I'm gonna start with the rectangle. And I'm going to actually press the D unit up, pretty much just because I have a seam here on the edge on the other side, and this will help reduce too much bulk. Here we go, I put that to the side. I'm gonna do the other column that's just like that one, the same way. All right, now let's do the middle unit. Press it just like we do typically, and when you open it, you should notice that it becomes one long straight unit. Be very careful here to not tug on it too much because again, this diagonal cut can warp pretty easily. All right, so looking at our middle unit, if you have a little overhang like this, that's really not a big deal if it's driving you crazy and you gotta clean it up. Remember, this is gonna be a 2.5 inch wide strip. Just line up the 2.5 inch as best you can on each side and then trim it just where it's overhanging a little bit. Do the same on the other side. And like I said, you don't need to do this, but I know, some of us like it to look very clean. This is the result of a too scant of a 1/4 inch seam allowance, which is fine. All right, so now your middle column is done. Let's go ahead and lay out our side columns just like this. And so now we just need to attach our bottom squares to our side columns. So I'm going to move the middle unit out of the way for now. And once again, I'm going to take this D unit that's already attached and I'm going to lay it right side down on top of that bottom square and pin in place. Do the same for the other column, right side down. Just make sure it's all lined up on the edges and pin in place. All right, and again, I'm going to sew these together at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, so once again, we can just press these open. So now we have our 3 strips built. We just have to sew them together. So make sure you have it laid out the way you want. Oh, that's not right. But again, if you wanted to sew it together this way, that would be another really cool block. You can see we have an X design instead of a rounded diamond design, which I think was pretty cool. You don't have to stick to the block. You're not gonna lose anything if you redesign the block a different way. So I am going to start on the right side. I'm going to sew this middle C blocks onto this side right here by folding it right side together along that long middle seam. All right, so let's talk real quick about these angles. I am not a stickler for having points match up. You might be. So if you want some advice for that, when you lay these right sides together, this piece on the right, the top corner of it should be a 1/4 inch past the seam on the left-hand side of your D unit. So visually, this is going to make more sense if you look at it than if I explain it. What I do is I just line up the middle strip with the top edge of my unit and make sure it's, for the most part, centered. So for example, mine is a little bit shorter than my other unit. That's again just because of scant 1/4 inch seam allowances. I will trim all that down later, but it might not turn out a perfect point. What you can do is just measure about a 1/4 inch over and make sure that this seam between your C units is on the 1/4 inch mark. So it's the seam between the C units is a 1/4 inch past the seam between the D and square units. If you're new to quilt blocks, don't even stress out about this. On the other quilt blocks I made, these points do not match up and you can't even notice. Perfect points are usually something that only the person who made the block gets frustrated about, and in a finished quilt, you don't notice it. All right, so we're gonna sew this together again at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So when we're pressing it, I actually like to press the C unit up just like that. So press it to set and then push it up. And that is probably the most perfect matchup I've had yet of these corners. If yours is off, if it's more to one way or the other, again, don't worry about it. You will not notice it in the finished quilt. And we're going to be making a lot more quilt blocks with a lot more corners that are designed to match up, but probably won't. And that is okay. The last stitch is just attaching that 3rd column. So once again, we can lay them right sides together. I'm gonna rotate this. Just like before, if you want this corner to match up pretty well, I use the grid lines on my cutting mat and I line up this seam between the D unit and one of the squares along one of my grid lines. And then I match up the seam between my C units a 1/4 inch away, and then just line up the top edge, just like that. Don't worry if your edges are overlapping or anything like that, we'll clean it up. If you find that by doing this, your block is way off, then just don't do that. Just center it along that top line and sew together. All right, final stitch, 1/4 inch seam allowance. Let's press this last seam, set it. Yeah, this one didn't match up perfectly. You can see, I mean, I don't know if you can see, but it's over to the left just a little bit. I'm not worried about it. On the very end here, if you want to starch these seams, you can. Suggest spraying a very light mist. So I am not gonna spray all over. I'm just going to kind of over the top of it, gentle mist, and you can go over your block. What that should do is just kind of help keep those seams nice and flat. Just like that. Don't stretch it while you're pressing. Just press it all down. If you spray too much of that starch, your fabric is going to kind of look wet and wavy, and then it's going to stay that way because it dries like paper in a wet and wavy design, which I have done many, many, many times, and all the steam in my iron could not get it out. So I am pretty cautious with the starch. Once your block is complete, we're gonna just clean up the edges just like we did when it was a smaller unit. So I'm going to use my 10.5 inch by 10.5 inch ruler first, just to kind of show you what I'm talking about. So you can see that I have some edges of my block that are overhanging the 10.5 inch by 10.5 inch ruler. For me, that's good because that means my block is going to be the right size. So what I'm gonna do first is I'm going to trim this down to a perfect 10.5 inch by 10.5 inch block by just kind of centering it over my design using my rotary cutter. And I'm just going to rotate the whole unit just like that. All right, so if I lift up my ruler and I lift up my block, there are my remnants. So let's say your block doesn't match up to 10.5 inches by 10.5 inches. If it's just a little bit off, if it's between 10 and 3/8 and 10.5 inches, that's fine. Leave it, it's going to be fine. However, let's say your block is a lot smaller than it's supposed to be. Like it's a 10.25 inch by a 10.25 inch block, kind of with a lot of wavy edges. If that's the case, I want you to cut your block down to 10 inches by 10 inches. So to show you what to do, I'm gonna take my first super scrappy block and I'm gonna actually cut this thing down to 10 inches by 10 inches just to show you what to do to fix a block that is just too small. So what I'm gonna do is line it up in the middle, and you can see this block is far from perfect. And I'm actually just gonna take a pencil to help me mark this. Now, ideally, you're gonna center your 10-inch design in the middle of this block, but that can be difficult to do with a 6-inch by 12-inch ruler. So I'm just going to kind of line it up with the middle column at like the 4 and 6-inch marks and just go along the edge, drawing a line, and then I'll just match up my ruler with that line that I partially drew and cut, just like that. And now I'm going to cut down the opposite side so that this is 10 inches wide, just like that. So 10 inches wide, I'm going to, and again, this is only for drastic situations where your block is just way too small. I don't want you to throw your block away. I want you to learn how to adjust it to make it work for you instead of against you. So there's that. And now let's do the opposite sides. Again, we want a 10-inch wide block. So once again, I'm just lining my 4 and 6-inch marks along that center column and then just drawing a line along the edge of my ruler and then using my rotary cutter and ruler to cut along that line, trying to keep everything, you know, as stable as possible. And then last cut, draw a line and trim down. All right, so now we have a 10-inch by 10-inch block, but we still do want it to be a 10.5 inch by 10.5 inch block. We're going to do a redesign now. We're gonna actually add a couple strips to the side and to the bottom to give this, it's gonna be a different look, but it's going to end up the right size. So I'm back to my scrap bin and I wanted to get a nice piece of scrap that's at least 11 inches long and at least 2 inches wide. You could use multiple scraps for this. What I want is I want one cut of fabric that is 1 inches by 10 inches and another cut of fabric that is 1 inch by 11 inch. So first I'm going to cut this down because it is too long. All right, so the first thing you want to do is have a nice straight edge. So I always just trim it down just a hair because this is not a straight edge currently. And now cut off a 1 inch strip. And it's okay if it's longer than 11 inches. We actually want everything to be a little bit bigger so that it goes together easier in the end and we have enough extra to trim it down to the proper size. Cut yourself off a second strip that's 1 inch wide. Grab your block that's too small, and we're going to lay one along the side just like that. We're going to sew this one on the right first, and then we'll lay this bottom one over it. So even if it's too long, don't worry about it. If you have a preferred side you want to use, figure that out now, but just lay it right sides together and pin along that edge. All right, now take this to the sewing machine and sew along this pinned edge at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now you can go ahead and press this edge open. There we go. Press the back of it as well to help it stay. Now, looking at your block with this extra side, you're going to need to add this other strip on either edge that connects to the other strip you added. So for me, I'm going to add it on the bottom. So before I add it, I need to trim off this bottom strip so that it's the right length. I don't want it overhanging like this. So line up one of your grid marks on that seam you just sewed. Line up the other edge so it's right against the bottom of your block and just trimmed off that tail. Now grab your other 1 inch strip and lay that wrong sides together along the edge. If it's longer than it needs to be, that's okay. And then just pin together and sew at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once again, go ahead and press this seam open. All right, now when we check our block, it should measure a little more than 10.5 inches by 10.5 inches. So we're good. And now you should be able to cut this down to 10.5 inches by 10.5 inches. So here it is, here's our finished block. It's so pretty. I really like how we changed up the contrast this time. You can see instead of having like the center be more of a dark color, I don't know, you can switch up the design of this so much based on what color fabrics you use, how dark they are, how light they are. You could turn these square units inwards and have more of an X design instead of a, diamond design. I love that. And I encourage you guys to change up this design however you want. You don't win a prize for it being perfect or for it looking like mine. I want this to be kind of custom for you. I know when I pull fabric and when I'm kind of putting a block together, I really use things and put it together in a way that goes with the mood that I'm in right now. For example, I've been sick with a terrible cold for the last 10 days and I am very angry about that. So I used a lot of red here because I'm not very happy about that. But later on in life, when I look at this quilt block, I'm going to remember like, I just got done coughing for 10 days straight and I was not happy about that. So that's what I like about quilt blocks. They tell a story. Also, here's our quilt block that we adjusted in case your block measures significantly smaller than 10.5 inches by 10.5 inches. If you're not planning on making the quilt, it doesn't matter if it's not 10.5 by 10.5, okay? Keep it to the side, and whenever you're going to use it for a bag, a pouch, a table mat, whatever you're going to use it for later, you can add fabric or take away fabric from it based on what you're going to use for it then. I personally like to have quilt blocks stacked up at all times to use in different projects because I find they add a really cool custom design to basic things, like a basic tote bag. Not so basic anymore with a cool quilt block. If you are planning on making the quilt, don't forget you have to make 3 of these blocks this month. Unless you don't like the block, then don't make them. Wait until another month and find a block you do really like. If you really, really enjoy making this block, make a whole bunch of them. So if you haven't already subscribed, please consider subscribing to the channel. We have new tutorials every single Monday. Don't forget, we got t-shirts. I don't know, I designed this myself. I think it's super fun, super cute. It kind of shows off in the real world that, you're a quilter in progress. You're not a work in progress. You're a quilter in progress. I will have a link for these down in the description below. If you have any questions, if you have any tips, suggestions, anything you do that's different or the same from what I did, make sure to leave them in the comment section down below. I'm super excited to see how everybody builds their quilt blocks If you make this block, please leave a comment down below and let me know. How did it go? Did it come together well? Did it not come together well? Is there anything you would change? Let me know in the comments. If you post them on social media, don't forget to use the hashtag OklaRoots Block Party. We'll be checking that all the time. If you're not in the Facebook groups that I have listed down below, consider joining them. This is a super fun sewing community, and having you guys discuss all the things that we're making and ask questions, I just love that. However, I do want to encourage you, when you post photos of your quilt block, if you struggled, that's okay, all right? We all struggle. But if you struggled, I want you to work as hard as you can to post a photo of it and say something positive about your block that you made. Not negative. It's so easy for us. We post a picture of the block and we're like, well, the points didn't really match up, but I tried, right? What are you talking about? I see that so many times and I'm like, that's a beautiful project. Why would you, poo-poo on it by pointing out a flaw that nobody's even gonna see? So, challenge for this month and every month is that when you post your quilt block, you have to write something positive about the block you made. It can't be about how you like the video. You can say you like the video, but that doesn't count as your positive remark of your block. It has to be something positive, like, I really like the colors that I picked, or I really like the design that came out by using the darker and lighter fabrics. That's what I want. I want you to post something positive about something you made. You are more than welcome to ask for advice. Like, hey, anybody have any suggestions on how to really get these points to match up? That's fine, but I encourage you to not point out the flaws, but instead point out what you like about the block. Challenge. I hope you accept that challenge. I'll be watching. I'm watching you guys. All right, I hope you have a great rest of the week. We will have another block in April. In April's tutorial, we will be using the Cricut Maker to cut out most of the fabric. And then for the rest of the blocks, we will be using a combination of templates and the Cricut Maker to cut out our fabric. Thank you so much for watching. Get out there and make something. Bye.